He laughed. Right there, in front of 200 people holding champagne flutes and wearing their best smiles, Damian Blackwood laughed at his wife. Not a cruel laugh. Almost worse, a dismissive one. The kind a man gives when he's already moved on from a conversation he never bothered to start. Charlotte had just whispered, "Tonight is our 10th anniversary. Please, just 1 hour." And Damien, the man who made rival crime bosses sweat through their suits, glanced at her the way you glance at a notification you don't plan to open, and said, "If a marriage can't survive a few busy years, maybe it was never that strong." Then he turned back to his capos. She stood there holding a glass of sparkling water, completely still, while the party continued around her like she was furniture. By 2:17 a.m., her wedding ring was on the marble floor, and the most feared man in New York was finally, truly afraid. If this story already has you feeling something, stay with me. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Stories like this one, they don't come back around twice. The charity gala was Charlotte's idea, 3 years ago. She had proposed it carefully, the way she proposed everything to Damien. Not as a demand, not as a complaint, but as a quiet offering. The Blackwood Foundation, she'd suggested, could host an annual fundraiser for children's literacy programs across the city. It would give the family a visible philanthropic identity. It would be good for the public image he cared so much about. It would be something they could build together. Damien had agreed in about 40 seconds, signed the paperwork, and never attended a single planning meeting, so Charlotte ran it. Every year. She selected the venues, negotiated with caterers, managed the guest lists, wrote the speeches, including the ones Damien occasionally delivered when he showed up, and stood at the entrance every November in whatever dress she'd chosen without his input, smiling until her face ached, telling people Damien was just running a few minutes late. Tonight she wore deep burgundy. She'd bought it 6 weeks ago during a lunch break, alone, tried it on in a department store fitting room with bad lighting, and told her reflection she looked fine. Not beautiful. Fine. That had felt honest. The ballroom of the Meridian Grand was full by 7. Old money and new money and money that didn't like to be asked where it came from. Senators' wives and hedge fund managers, and a retired federal judge who owed Damien a favor that neither of them ever discussed in company. Everyone dressed magnificently, everyone performing the version of themselves they wanted the room to believe. Charlotte moved through it all with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this so many times she'd stopped feeling it. She knew which alderman's wife needed to be steered away from the open bar by 8:30. She knew which table had the quiet rivalry between 2 philanthropist couples that could curdle the entire evening if they sat too close. She knew that the keynote speaker, a former school principal from the Bronx whose literacy program the foundation had funded, needed to go on at 8, not 8:15, because the man's blood sugar dropped and he got shaky if he stood too long without eating. She knew all of it. She handled all of it. She told 3 different people that Damien was so sorry, an unavoidable situation, you know how it is, and watched them nod with complete understanding because, yes, of course, a man like Damien Blackwood ran on his own clock. That was simply the price of his particular greatness. By 8:40, she stopped checking her phone. By 9, she stopped checking the door. The keynote went beautifully. The principal from the Bronx spoke about a 12-year-old girl who'd come into his program unable to read past a 3rd grade level and left 2 years later writing her own short stories. And his voice broke a little in the middle, and the room went very quiet in the good way, the genuine way. The way rooms rarely go quiet at charity galas because sincerity is uncomfortable for people who spend their evenings performing. Charlotte felt the back of her throat tighten. She pressed 2 fingers lightly against her collarbone and breathed through it. She was mid-conversation with a foundation board member about next year's outreach initiative when the room shifted. It didn't announce itself. It never did. But she felt it, the way air pressure changes before a storm, that subtle molecular rearrangement that happens when something significant enters a space. She turned. Damien Blackwood stood at the entrance to the ballroom. Even after 10 years, the sight of him still did something complicated to her nervous system, something she resented and couldn't quite stop. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the particular posture of a man who had never, in his adult life, needed to make himself smaller for anyone. His dark suit was impeccable. His jaw was set. His eyes moved across the room in that way they always did, taking inventory, cataloging exits and threats and useful people before he'd taken 3 steps inside. 2 bodyguards flanked him. Marco and a newer man whose name Charlotte didn't know. Behind them, Vincent Caruso, Damien's consigliere, his most trusted advisor, a man who'd been at Damien's right hand since before Charlotte entered the picture, was already angling toward a corner of the room, pulling out his phone. The room reconfigured itself around Damien's presence. People stepped aside. Men straightened. Women smiled in that particular way, the smile that acknowledges power without directly addressing it. Charlotte set down her drink. She crossed the floor toward him. Not hurrying, she'd stopped hurrying toward Damien a long time ago, and reached him near the east side of the bar where the lighting was a little dimmer and the crowd was slightly thinner. 2 hours, she said. She kept her voice even. The program started at 7. Damien looked at her. Not through her. That would come later. For a moment, he actually looked at her, and she saw the familiar thing in his eyes, that flicker of something that might have been guilt if it hadn't been so quickly replaced by the logistics of a man managing too many simultaneous problems. There was a situation, he said. Castellano's people moved the meeting. There's always a situation. Charlotte. One word. The particular intonation he used when he wanted her to understand that further conversation was inadvisable. The tribute is at 9:30, she said. They're honoring us. Together. As a couple. I planned it 3 months ago. You knew about it. He reached past her for a glass of water from the bar, and the casualness of the gesture, the way he simply moved through her sentence as though it were weather, made something shift beneath her sternum. A small, seismic thing, the kind that doesn't show on the surface. I'll be here for it, he said. Damien, I said I'll be here. He scanned the room. Where's Harrington? He was supposed to confirm the zoning vote by tonight. Charlotte stood very still. She was aware of Marco 3 feet away, professionally pretending not to hear. She was aware of a cluster of guests nearby who were absolutely listening while also pretending not to. She was aware of the keynote speaker at a nearby table eating the dinner he'd needed and looking content, unaware of anything. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which had slowed down instead of speeding up. She'd read once that the body does that under certain kinds of prolonged stress. The heart slows, the system goes quiet, the nervous system shifts into a kind of low-frequency endurance mode that is nothing like calm. Do you know what tonight is? She asked, quietly. Damien's eyes came back to her. Our anniversary. Yes. I'm here, Charlotte. You've been here for 9 minutes. Something crossed his face. Not irritation. He reserved that for people who challenged his business decisions. This was subtler. The expression of a man who understands he's on a losing side of an argument, but has calculated that engaging further costs more than it gains. We'll talk at home, he said. We've been saying that for 4 years. His jaw tightened. I'm not doing this here. I know. She picked up the glass of water she'd abandoned. You're never doing it anywhere. She turned and walked back toward the board member she'd left mid-sentence, and she heard Damien say her name once, quietly, behind her. She didn't turn around. She kept moving, kept smiling at the right faces, kept thanking the right people, kept being the functional half of a partnership that had stopped functioning somewhere around year 6 and simply hadn't announced it yet. The tribute happened at 9:30. They stood at the podium together. Charlotte stood 2 feet from the man she had married in a garden in Connecticut on a clear October afternoon, and she shook hands with a foundation board member who said, "What a remarkable couple, what an inspiration, a decade of partnership." And she smiled and said, "Thank you. It's been a journey," and felt, with sudden vivid certainty, that she was describing something that had already ended. Damien's hand found the small of her back. Light pressure, familiar, automatic. The gesture of a man who remembered, on some muscle memory level, that this was the appropriate physical posture for this specific category of public moment. She didn't lean into it. She also didn't move away. The photographs were taken. The applause happened. Someone made a joke about 10 years being a milestone in any industry, and the crowd laughed, and Damien laughed, and Charlotte smiled at a fixed point in the middle distance and counted the exits. Afterward, near the edge of the ballroom where the servers were cycling out the dessert course, she found him in conversation with Vincent and 2 men she didn't recognize, not guests, not donors. The body language was wrong for a social conversation, too controlled, too still. She waited until there was a pause. "Damien," she said, "can I have 20 minutes?" He held up one finger without looking at her, the finger of a man managing something more important than whatever this was. She waited. The conversation continued. Figures, territory. A name she half recognized from a newspaper article, something about waterfront development, something about a city contract that had changed hands. She waited 4 minutes. She counted. Then she said, "Is our marriage something you're still interested in?" The conversation stopped. Damien turned to her fully. The two men she didn't recognize suddenly became very interested in the dessert display. Vincent studied the far wall. Charlotte. Her name again, but different this time. A warning wrapped in a word. "It's a direct question," she said. "I'm asking directly." "This isn't... I know it isn't the time. It's never the time. I'm asking anyway." She kept her hands loose at her sides. Her voice was steady. She'd rehearsed this, not the words but the steadiness. She'd practiced it alone in the guest bathroom at 6 p.m. while doing her mascara, looking herself in the eye and saying, "Be steady, Charlotte, be steady." "Do you want to be married to me? Yes or no?" Damien looked at her for a long moment, and then he said it, not cruel. Not even particularly loud, just certain, in the way that men who have navigated dangerous rooms for 20 years speak when they want a matter closed. If a marriage can't survive a few busy years, maybe it was never that strong. The room didn't go quiet. The party continued exactly as before. No one near enough to hear reacted. The string quartet transitioned into something light and European, and the servers moved through the crowd with their silver trays, and the whole magnificent machine of the evening kept turning. Charlotte looked at him. She looked at him the way you look at something when you are memorizing it, when some part of you has already accepted that you are looking at it for the last time. "Okay," she said. He heard the word and registered it as concession. She saw it in the slight easing of his shoulders. "We'll talk at home," he said. "I've got another 45 minutes here, then." "And if it's really over?" she said, not interrupting, continuing. "What then?" He picked up his drink. "People move on. I can too." 5 words. "I can too." She nodded once, the way you nod when someone has answered the question you actually needed answered, even though it isn't the answer you would have chosen. "Good night, Damien," she said. "Charlotte," but she was already walking, and this time she didn't count the exits because she already knew exactly which one she was taking. She retrieved her coat from the cloakroom, tipped the attendant $20, stood outside for 40 seconds in the November air until a cab came, and got in. In the cab, she didn't cry. She looked out the window at the lights of the city moving past and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, about a specific Tuesday in March 4 years ago when she'd had a minor surgical procedure, nothing serious, a routine thing, and had come home from the hospital by herself in a cab because Damien was in a meeting in Boston, and she hadn't told him it was happening because she'd already known he wouldn't be able to come, and she hadn't wanted to ask for something she already knew the answer to, so she'd just handled it. Alone. Took the cab, got the procedure, took another cab home, made herself soup, watched 2 episodes of something forgettable on television, and went to bed. She'd never told him. Not because she was keeping it from him. Just because the moment for telling him never felt available. She had spent 4 years waiting for moments that were never available. At the house, she went directly to the bedroom. She changed out of the burgundy dress, hung it carefully, and stood in the closet for a moment with her hands against the cool wood of the shelf. Then she got one suitcase from the upper shelf. She packed methodically. Not frantically. She wasn't running from anything. She was walking toward something, though she didn't know yet exactly what. She packed the practical things. Clothes for 2 weeks, the small pharmacy of daily necessities, her laptop, her journals, 12 of them, a whole decade's worth of the conversation she'd been having with herself because she couldn't have it with him. She went to the jewelry cabinet. She considered the pearls he'd given her on their 5th anniversary. Left them. She took her mother's bracelet, left everything else. She picked up her wedding ring from where it sat in the small crystal dish on her side of the dresser. She held it for a moment. The platinum was warm from the dish's position near the window. She had worn this ring for 10 years. She had looked at it during surgeries she went through alone and arguments she lost, and anniversaries that passed, and dinners she ate by herself, and evenings she spent reading beside a man who was present in the room and absent in every way that mattered. She set the ring down on the marble surface of the entryway table. Then she thought about it for another moment, picked it back up, and walked to the bedroom. She set it on the floor. Not dramatically. Not with any ceremony. She just set it on the marble floor in the center of the doorway, where it would be impossible to miss. Because Damien was very good at missing things. She wanted, this one last time, to make it impossible. She pulled her suitcase downstairs, called a car, and stood at the front door of the house she had turned into a home and maintained as a home, and defend it as a home. Defended it against his absence, against her own loneliness, against the slow, patient erosion of a decade. And she breathed. The car came. She got in. She did not look back at the house. She had already memorized it. Damien arrived home at 2:09 a.m. He came through the side entrance, the one connected to the garage, and moved through the kitchen without turning on the lights, the way he always did when he came home late. He loosened his tie. He set his phone on the kitchen counter and poured 2 fingers of water and drank it standing up. Then he went upstairs. The bedroom was dark. He reached for the lamp. The bed was made. That was the first thing. The bed was made at 2 in the morning, which meant no one had slept in it, which meant Charlotte wasn't here, which could mean any number of... He saw the ring. It lay on the marble floor in the center of the doorway, catching the lamplight. That small platinum circle that he had placed on her finger in a garden in Connecticut 11 years ago, that she had worn every day since, that he had stopped noticing the way you stop noticing things that have always been there. Damien Blackwood stood very still. Outside, somewhere on the sound, a boat's horn sounded once and went silent. He bent down and picked up the ring. It was cold. He stood in his empty bedroom holding his wife's wedding ring, and he felt something that he did not have precise language for because he had spent 20 years training himself out of the habit of naming feelings. It was large. It was moving fast. It had the specific quality of something that had been building for a long time and had now arrived all at once. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He sat there for a long time. He was still sitting there when his phone lit up on the kitchen counter downstairs with a message from Vincent about the Castellano situation. He didn't go downstairs. He sat with the ring in his closed hand and the quiet of the house pressing in around him, and he understood, with the clarity that comes only when it's too late to do anything useful with it, that he had just lost the only thing in his life that had never been about power, money, or survival. He had lost it the way you lose things when you're not paying attention. Slowly. Then, all at once, he sat on the edge of that bed until 4 in the morning, not sleeping, not moving much, just sitting with the ring in his closed fist and the particular silence of a house that has recently lost its only living warmth. At some point, the heating system cycled off, and the temperature dropped 2 degrees, and he didn't notice. At some point, his phone lit up 3 more times downstairs, and he didn't go to it. What he did, eventually, was open his hand and look at the ring again. Platinum. Simple band. She had picked it herself. She'd told him once, early on, that she didn't want anything ornate, didn't want diamonds on her wedding band, because a wedding band wasn't a display. It was a fact, and facts didn't need decoration. He'd found that interesting at the time. He'd found a lot of things about her interesting at the time. He closed his hand again. At 4:15, he got up, went to the bathroom, ran cold water over his face, and looked at himself in the mirror for approximately 10 seconds before looking away. He went downstairs. He picked up his phone. 6 messages from Vincent, 2 from Marco, 1 from a number he didn't recognize that turned out to be a new contact from the Castellano side who wanted to confirm the terms they'd discussed that evening. He set the phone face down on the counter. He opened the refrigerator, stood in front of it for a long moment looking at its contents without processing any of them, closed it, opened a cabinet, found a half-empty box of crackers, took 3 of them, ate them standing at the counter tasting nothing. Then he went to the study. The study was his room, dark wood, heavy curtains, the kind of room that projected exactly the authority it was intended to project. He'd spent thousands of hours in this room making decisions that other men's lives depended on. He sat behind the desk now and he pulled open the bottom left drawer, the one that stayed locked, the one whose key lived on his personal keychain, and he took out the burner phone he kept for the contacts that couldn't exist on his regular line. He called a number. It rang twice. "It's 4 in the morning," said the voice on the other end. Flat. Unhappy. "I need a trace started," Damien said. "Personal matter, discretion level 1. A pause. "Who?" "My wife." A longer pause. He could hear the man recalibrating. "She leave?" "Find her," Damien said, and hung up. He sat back in the chair. The leather creaked. The house made the small sounds that houses make at 4 in the morning when the people inside them are the only things moving, and he sat there in the sound of it and thought, with the mechanical clarity of a man who solves problems for a living, about what he knew. He knew she'd been unhappy. He wasn't blind. He'd never been blind. That was the thing that would keep him up later. That was the thing that would cost him. He had seen the unhappiness the way you see a check engine light, visible, acknowledged, deferred. There was always something more urgent, There was always the next thing that needed managing, the next crisis that couldn't wait. And Charlotte was stable, Charlotte was capable, Charlotte didn't make ultimatums or throw things or issue dramatic threats. Charlotte simply waited. He had relied on her waiting. He understood that now at 4:20 in the morning in a way he had not understood it at 9:45 in a ballroom, which was the precise window in which understanding would have been useful. He put the ring on the desk in front of him. He looked at it for a long time. Then Vincent knocked on the study door. Damien hadn't heard him come in. Vincent had a key, and he'd apparently let himself in through the front, which meant he'd either been called by Marco or had seen enough of the evening's end to come on his own judgment. "Come in," Damien said. Vincent entered. He was 61 years old, a compact man with silver hair, and the posture of someone who had spent 4 decades making himself useful to dangerous people. He looked at Damien. He looked at the ring on the desk. He sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited, which he had earned the right to do sometime around 2003. "Where is she?" Vincent said. "I don't know yet." Vincent nodded slowly. His eyes moved to the ring again, then away. "The Castellano confirmation is waiting," he said. "I know. If we don't respond by morning—" "Vincent." Damien looked at him. "Give me 10 minutes before you make this about Castellano." Vincent sat back, said nothing. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but they'd known each other long enough to have functional silences. "I told her people move on," Damien said finally. Vincent's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. "Tonight?" he asked. "At the gala. She asked what would happen if it was really over, and I told her people move on. That I could too." Damien's voice was even, clinical. The voice he used to describe problems, not feelings. "She left 3 hours later." Vincent said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That was a stupid thing to say?" "Yes. To your wife. On your anniversary." "I'm aware, Vincent. In front of—" "I said I'm aware." Damien's voice sharpened on the last word, and then went flat again immediately. "I need her found, quietly. No one outside your personal circle touches this information. Not Marco, not the Ricci crew, nobody. Understood?" Vincent stood. "And Castellano?" Damien picked up the ring and put it in his jacket pocket. "Handle it. You know what we agreed to." Vincent moved to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Damien," he said. "What?" "She's been running that foundation alone for 3 years. Every event, every donor call, every board meeting. I don't think most of the men in that room tonight knew you had a wife." He left before Damien could respond. The house was quiet again. Damien sat with his hand in his pocket, fingers wrapped around the ring, and did not sleep. The next morning arrived with the indifferent efficiency that mornings have. The light came through the curtains, gray and flat. November, doing what November does in New York. Damien had moved from the study to the kitchen sometimes around 6, made coffee he barely drank, and was on a call with Vincent by 7:15 that had nothing to do with Charlotte and everything to do with the ongoing operational machinery that did not pause for personal catastrophe. Marco arrived at 8. He came into this kitchen, saw Damien at the table with the untouched coffee and the look of a man who had not slept and had the good professional sense not to comment on either. "Morning," Marco said. "Cameras," Damien said. "Every exit from the gala. Pull the footage from last night. I want to know what car she took and where it was headed." Marco blinked, just once. "Sir, that's Mrs. Blackwood. She left the gala. I want to know where she went." Something crossed Marco's face. Not surprise exactly. More like the expression of a man who had understood for some time that this was the kind of house where this would eventually happen, and was now navigating the correct protocol for it. "I'll make the calls," Marco said. He left. Damien sat at the table in the gray morning light and the quiet of the big kitchen and thought about the box. He'd remembered it during the night, somewhere around 5 a.m. A box Charlotte kept on the upper shelf of her closet, pushed to the back. He'd seen it once, 2 years ago, and asked what it was, and she'd said letters, and he'd said to who, and she'd said to myself, and he'd accepted that in the way he'd accepted many things about her inner life, with a nod, with no follow-up, with the implicit assumption that it was her territory, and she managed her territory fine without him. He went upstairs. He stood in front of her closet for a moment. The burgundy dress from last night was hung on the outer rod. She'd been here. She'd come home before she left. She'd hung the dress carefully because that was who she was. She hung the dress even while she was leaving. He reached up and brought down the box. It was a regular shoebox, the kind that stacks. Heavy. He carried it to the bed and sat down and opened it. Letters. Dozens of them. Each one folded once, no envelopes, dated in the top right corner in her handwriting. That particular slanted print she had, efficient and clear, the handwriting of someone who thought before they wrote and meant what they put down. He picked up the one on top. March 14th, 3 years ago. Had the biopsy scare today. The kind of Tuesday that makes you want someone's hand to hold in a waiting room. I held my own. The results were fine. I didn't tell Dee because he's in Chicago, and there was nothing he could do, and I've gotten used to being the person who manages my own fear. I think that's supposed to feel like strength. Some days it does. Some days it just feels like practice for being alone. He put it down. He picked up another. November of last year, 10th anniversary dinner. The one I'd planned, canceled because of the Ricci situation. Ate leftover pasta at the kitchen counter and watched the city lights through the window, and thought about the first year, when he came home from a meeting at 2 in the morning and woke me up because he'd found a 24-hour place that sold the specific kind of ice cream I'd mentioned wanting 3 weeks earlier. He remembered that. He doesn't remember our anniversary anymore. I don't know when the exchange happened. I don't think there was a specific day. Damien set the letter on the bed. He didn't read another one. He sat there with his hands on his knees looking at the box full of things she'd never said to him, this entire parallel record of a marriage from the inside. And he felt the specific nausea of a man who has just been handed the evidence of his own extended failure and cannot dispute a single word of it. He sat there for a long time. His phone rang. He let it ring out. It rang again. He looked at the screen. Marco. He answered. The car service, Marco said. She took a black car from the gala, dropped her at the house at 11:50. Then another car, called from inside the house, picked her up at 12:40. Penn Station. Damien stood. Penn Station. We lose her there. She bought a ticket at the counter, cash. The cameras? What direction? North. That's all the gate agent could confirm. North corridor trains. Damien walked to the window. Outside, the Long Island landscape was bare and gray, the trees stripped, the water and the sound the color of pewter. Vincent's contact, he said. Hargrove. The PI? Get him today, not tomorrow. Today. Yes, sir. And Marco. Sir. This does not go to the crew. No one in the organization knows she's gone. If anyone asks, Mrs. Blackwood is traveling for the foundation. That's the story. A pause. Brief. Understood, Marco said. Damien ended the call. He looked at the box of letters on the bed. He thought about putting it back on the shelf. Then he thought about what it would mean to put it back. To replace it. To continue in this house alone. To go back downstairs and run the organization and pretend that nothing had fundamentally shifted. He took the box to the study. He was going to read every letter. The first argument came 4 days later. Vincent had found nothing. Or more precisely, Vincent's contact had found nothing useful, which amounted to the same thing operationally. Charlotte had not used a credit card, had not contacted anyone in their social circle, had not surfaced in any of the places the search had, with some difficulty, managed to surveil. It was as if she'd been planning this for longer than one evening. The thought sat in Damien's chest like a stone. It was also that week that the Ricci situation began unraveling. Thomas Ricci, not the head of the family, the son, 29 years old and possessed of his father's arrogance without his father's patience, had apparently decided that the terms of the waterfront arrangement they'd finalized in September were now subject to revision. He'd sent a representative, a lawyer with soft hands and a very expensive suit, who arrived at a meeting Damien was barely present for mentally, and spent 40 minutes outlining proposed amendments that were, in the language of contract law, a near-complete reversal of what had been agreed. Damien let the lawyer finish. Then he said, "Tell Thomas that the terms were agreed to by his father. His father's signature is on the document. If Thomas has concerns, he can call me directly." The lawyer smiled the way lawyers smile when they've been briefed to smile, regardless of what the other party says. Mr. Ricci the younger is simply, "Tell him to call me." Damien stood. "We're done." Afterward, Vincent caught up with him in the hallway. "That's going to cause a problem," Vincent said. "I know." Thomas is looking for an excuse. He's been looking for an excuse since his father stepped back. If we're not... "I know, Vincent." Damien kept walking. "Handle the prelims. I'll deal with Thomas directly." "When?" "When I'm ready." Vincent grabbed his arm. Not hard, but the contact stopped Damien cold because Vincent did not do that. In 20 years, Vincent had never physically stopped him. Damien, Vincent's voice was low. The hallway was empty, but he'd made it lower anyway. You have not been in a single meeting this week, not actually in it. Richie's lawyer was in that room for 40 minutes, and you let him run the table because you weren't paying attention. 2 of the capos have noticed. I've been fielding calls. Damien looked at the hand on his arm. Vincent released it. I am running the organization, Damien said. You're in that house reading letters at 2 in the morning and coming to meetings with nothing behind your eyes. Vincent's jaw was set. I've known you for 20 years. I understand what's happening. I'm not questioning your grief. I'm telling you that grief in this business is a security risk. She's not dead. I know she's not dead. Then don't use that word. Damien. Vincent lowered his voice further. Ricci's boy is watching. The Castellano agreement is fragile. If you give either of them 30 days of distraction, they will find a crack and they will put something in it, and we will spend the next 2 years managing the consequences. He paused. You know this. You know I'm right. Damien said nothing. Let me increase Hargrove's resources, Vincent said. Let me make the search faster, and in the meantime, you need to be in those rooms the way you've always been in those rooms. Damien looked at him. Double Hargrove's team, he said, but no one from our side, external only. Agreed. And Vincent, Damien's eyes were very steady. The next time you put your hand on me in a hallway, you'd better have a better reason than this. Vincent held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Understood. He walked away. Damien stood in the empty hallway for a moment. The wallpaper was something Charlotte had chosen. He couldn't remember when. He couldn't remember discussing it. He had come home one day, and it was there, and it was tasteful, and he had said so, and she had said thank you, and that had been the entirety of his participation in the aesthetic decisions of the house he lived in. He noticed it now. He noticed all of it now. 3 weeks after she left, one of the letters undid him. He'd been reading them in order, but methodically, the way he approached most things. And he was into the second year of them when he found one dated a Tuesday in June, early in their marriage, when everything had still been close to good, or what he'd understood as good. I asked him tonight what he'd do if the whole thing just stopped. The business, the empire, all of it. If it just ended and we had to be 2 regular people. He laughed, not meanly, just genuinely surprised, the way someone laughs when the question hasn't occurred to them. He said he'd figure it out. He said as long as I was there, he'd figure it out. I believed him. I still do. I think the man who said that is still in there. I think he got buried under a very large amount of other things. I keep waiting for him to surface. I know that's probably naive. I just can't stop. Damien put the letter face down on the desk and pressed his palm flat against it. His hand was shaking slightly. He hadn't noticed when it started. He pressed down until the shaking stopped, and then he sat in the chair with his eyes on the wall and did the breathing exercise his doctor had recommended 3 years ago that he'd dismissed as useless and never tried until now. Slow in, hold 4 counts, slow out. And eventually the tightness in his chest went from unbearable to merely heavy. He could hear rain outside. Long Island in December, bare-limbed and gray. He got up and poured 2 fingers of something and carried it back to the desk and looked at the letter. He thought about June of that year. He could not recover a specific Tuesday in June. He had thousands of Tuesdays in his memory, and almost none of them featured Charlotte in the foreground. She was background. She was constant. She was home. He had made home into furniture. He opened his laptop. He pulled up the email Vincent had forwarded from Hargrove's team, the weekly update that so far had amounted to a series of negative results dressed up in investigative language. No trace. No confirmed location. A woman who had, apparently, decided to become a person that a criminal organization's full intelligence apparatus couldn't find. He thought about that. He thought about the planning it required. The cash. The deliberateness of Penn Station, North Corridor, no cards. This was not a woman who had made an impulsive decision at midnight. She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully. The realization didn't hurt less for being logical. It hurt differently. He picked up his phone and called Hargrove's direct line. Hargrove answered on the second ring. Mr. Blackwood. Talk to me about northern routes out of Penn Station, Damien said. I want to know every stop within 6 hours. We've been working through them, Hargrove said. Connecticut, Rhode Island, Boston, Portland, Maine, Damien said. A pause. Sir? She mentioned Maine once, a long time ago. Small coastal town. She'd gone there as a child. He could not remember the name of the town. He could not remember exactly when she'd mentioned it. He remembered only that she had some conversation, some evening, some dinner where he'd been half present, and that something about the way she said it had lodged somewhere in him without his permission. Check Maine. We can expand the search north, Hargrove said carefully, but it's a significant coastline. Then start where the quiet is, Damien said. She would go where the quiet is. He hung up. He sat back. I thought about a woman who had spent 10 years waiting for him in a loud house, who had gone to a quiet place on the water. And he thought about how completely and specifically he understood her need for that only now, only from here, only having lost her. He put the letter back in the box. He picked up the ring from the corner of the desk where he'd kept it every day since he'd found it on the floor, and he put it in his jacket pocket, and he stood up. The rain was heavier now. He had 47 letters left to read. He was going to read them all. And then, whether Ricci behaved or Castellano held or the whole empire decided to test him at once, he was going to find her. Not to argue, not to explain, just to stand in front of her and let her see, without any of the performance and none of the machinery, what 47 letters had done to the man who thought he'd already seen everything worth seeing. But Hargrove called back 6 hours later, and what he said stopped everything. We found a name she used, Hargrove said. Credit card opened 2 weeks before the gala, her mother's maiden name. Purchased a 6-month rental agreement. He paused. Mr. Blackwood. She wasn't leaving on impulse. The rental was signed November 1st. Damien stood very still. November 1st. 16 days before the gala. 16 days before he told her people move on. Before the ring on the floor, before any of this. She had already signed a lease somewhere. She had already decided. She had come to the gala anyway. She had stood beside him at that podium anyway, let him put his hand on the small of her back anyway, listened to him say those words anyway. And she had still hoped. Up until the moment he made hoping impossible. Damien sat down in whatever chair was closest, which happened to be the kitchen table, in the middle of the afternoon, with his coat still on. Where? He said. Coastal Maine, Hargrove said. Small town called Dunmore. Population around 3,000. She's been there 3 weeks. Damien's hand, in his pocket, found the ring. He held it. That's enough, he said quietly. I'll take it from here. Damien didn't go to Maine that night. He wanted to. He sat at that kitchen table with his coat on and the ring in his fist and the specific coordinates of her life. Dunmore, Maine, population 3,000, 6-month lease signed 16 days before she'd stood beside him at a podium and let him put his hand on her back one last time. And every instinct he had built over 20 years of decisive action told him to move. Get in the car, drive north, find her. He sat there for 40 minutes instead, because the thing that stopped him wasn't logistics. It wasn't the Ricci situation, or the Castellano agreement, or Vincent's warnings about distraction. It was something quieter and more damaging than any of that, something he had to sit with until he could name it. She had signed that lease 16 days before the gala. She had already decided, and she had still shown up. She had put on the burgundy dress and run his foundation's charity event, and stood at the podium beside him, and she had still, in some last remaining part of herself, hoped that he would be different that night. She had given him one final evening to be the man she married, and he had told her people move on. If he drove to Maine tonight, coat still on, running on no sleep, and raw adrenaline, and the particular desperation of a man who has just understood the size of what he's lost, he would be going for himself, not for her. He would be going because he couldn't stand the feeling, because movement was easier than stillness, because the Damien Blackwood who had run New York's most powerful organization for 15 years did not sit in kitchens and feel things. He acted, he solved, he closed. She had spent 10 years with that man. She didn't need more of him. He took his coat off. He made coffee. He went back to the letters. The next 3 weeks were the most difficult of his professional life, which was a sentence that had significant competition. The Ricci situation escalated on a Wednesday. Thomas Ricci, who had apparently interpreted Damien's brief inattention during the lawyer meeting as a broader structural weakness, made a move on a distribution arrangement in Queens that was, by any reasonable reading of their existing agreements, not his to touch. It was a small move, deliberately small. A test. Damien responded with a phone call to Thomas directly. It lasted 4 minutes. He kept his voice level throughout, which cost him something, and laid out with surgical precision exactly what would happen if Thomas's crew touched that arrangement again. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anything that required elaboration. He simply described consequences in the specific, credible language of a man who had delivered consequences before and found the experience unremarkable. Thomas backed down within the hour. Vincent, who had been present for the call, said nothing afterward. He didn't need to. The relief in the room was its own communication. Damien went back to the letters. He read them in the evenings, after the operational day was finished, sitting in the study with the door closed and a drink he didn't always finish. He read them slowly. He stopped when something hit him hard enough to require stopping. Some of them he read twice. By the 5th week, he had developed a specific, granular understanding of his own marriage that he had never possessed while living inside it. The particular archaeology of a decade, layer by layer, her voice underneath everything, patient and clear and never accusatory, which was somehow worse than accusations would have been. Accusations he knew how to handle. This he did not. There was a letter from year 3 that he kept returning to. She'd written it after a dinner party they'd hosted. He had a vague memory of the evening, something about a senator and a property developer, the usual assembly of useful relationships dressed up as social occasion. He worked the room for 3 hours, and I watched him and thought, he's extraordinary at this. He genuinely is. He knows what every person in that room needs to feel, and he gives it to them. He's been doing it with everyone except me for so long, I'm not sure he remembers what it felt like to just sit with me without an agenda. I don't think he knows he's doing it. I think the work became the default, and I became the background, and I don't think there was a conscious decision made. That's almost worse than if there had been. He read that one 3 times. Then Hargrove called with a complication. Someone else has been asking about her, Hargrove said. No preamble. Hargrove had learned that Damien did not need preamble. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. Who? We're still working that. A second investigative presence in Dunmore. Not ours, not law enforcement. Private. Professional. They've been in the town for approximately 10 days. 10 days? Damien stood up from the desk. You're telling me now? I confirmed it this morning. I wanted to be certain before... Who retained them? We're working on it. The contact trail is clean. Whoever hired them knows how to hire people. Damien was already moving toward the door. Stay on it. I want a name by morning. He called Vincent before he reached the hallway. Vincent answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been awake, which meant he'd been managing something. Ricci, Damien said, has Thomas made any move to locate Charlotte? A pause. 1 second too long. Vincent? There's been some talk, Vincent said carefully. Street level. Nothing I took seriously. What kind of talk? The kind that circulates when a boss is visibly distracted. People speculate about leverage. It's not, is Thomas Ricci looking for my wife? Another pause, shorter this time. Vincent making a decision. I think it's possible someone in his circle is exploring it as an option, Vincent said. I didn't bring it to you because I had nothing concrete, and you were already... You didn't bring it to me, Damien said very quietly, because you thought I couldn't handle it. I brought it to you the moment I had something worth bringing. You brought it to me after I found out from Hargrove that a second team is already in her town. Damien's voice was still quiet. That particular quiet that people who worked with him had learned was considerably more dangerous than volume. How long, Vincent? 2 days? Maybe 3. 2 days. She has been in that town for 5 weeks, and for 2 of those days there has been a second investigative team that you knew about and did not tell me, and in that same window Thomas Ricci's people have been discussing using her as leverage. Damien, I need you to understand something. He stopped walking. He was in the hallway outside the study, the one with the wallpaper Charlotte had chosen, and he stood very still in it. If anything happens to her because of a 2-day gap in your communication, there is no version of that outcome I recover from. Not professionally, not personally. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Vincent's voice, when it came, was different, quieter. The voice of a man who had finally received information he needed to properly calibrate. I understand, Vincent said. I'm going to Maine tonight. I'll have Marco alone. The word landed flat. I go alone. Damien, if Ricci's people are already, I go alone, he said again. Get me everything Hargrove has on the second team, in my car, in 30 minutes. He went upstairs. He packed nothing, changed his shirt, put on a different jacket, checked the small of his back out of muscle memory. He stood in the bedroom for exactly 5 seconds, looking at the made bed and the empty crystal dish on the dresser and the upper shelf of the closet where the box had been. Then he went downstairs and got in the car. He drove north. It took him 6 hours. He stopped once for gas and coffee he didn't want, standing under fluorescent lights at 2 in the morning outside a station in New Hampshire while the cold came off the Atlantic corridor and made the air taste like iron. He read Hargrove's file on his phone while the tank filled. The second team was 2 people, a man and a woman, registered at a motel 8 miles outside Dunmore under business names that traced to a Shell LLC that Hargrove's people were still unwinding. Professional, clean, patient, 10 days in position. He got back in the car. He reached Dunmore at 4:40 in the morning. The town was exactly what he would have predicted if he'd ever tried to predict it, which he hadn't. Small, coastal, the kind of place that smelled like salt water and wood smoke, and the specific quiet of a community that has survived a long time by minding its own concerns. The main street was 3 blocks, a diner, a hardware store, a post office the size of a living room, a small library. And at the end of the commercial strip, half a block from where the street turned toward the water, a bookstore with a hand-painted sign that read Title in dark blue letters. He drove past it slowly. The lights were off. Obviously, it was before 5 in the morning, but he stopped the car at the end of the block and sat there and looked at it. There was a small apartment above the store. A light was on. He sat in the car for a long time. He was not going to knock on her door at 5 in the morning. He was here to assess the situation. The second team, the Ricci angle, the logistics of keeping her safe without telling her she needed protecting, which was its own particular problem. He was not here to do what exactly? He hadn't let himself fully form the question of what came after finding her because the finding had felt like enough of an obstacle. He drove to the only motel in town, paid cash, lay on top of the bed covers in his jacket and stared at the ceiling. At 7, he called Hargrove. "The second team," he said. "Where are they now?" "Same motel as last night. They don't move until around 9. Pull every piece of identification they've used since arriving, rental cars, motel registration, any local purchases. Get me the LLC chain by noon. Working it. And Hargrove," Damien paused. "Has she been contacted? By anyone? Anything unusual in her pattern?" "Not that we've observed. She works the bookstore 6 days a week, walks to the water most evenings. Seems to know a few locals, the couple who own the diner, some people from the library. Keeps a quiet life." Damien said nothing for a moment. "She doing okay?" he asked. A beat. Hargrove was professional enough not to editorialize, but professional enough also to understand that this was not a surveillance question. "She looks settled," Hargrove said carefully. "Sir." Damien ended the call. He lay there another 20 minutes. Then he got up, washed his face, and drove to the diner. He ate eggs and toast at a corner table and drank 2 cups of coffee and watched the main street come alive in the gray December morning. A few trucks, a woman walking a dog the size of a small couch, a teenager on a bike moving with the particular unhurried energy of a place with nowhere urgent to be. At 8:50 he paid and walked out and turned toward the bookstore. He stood across the street. The title sign had a small card beneath it, open at 9. He could see warm light through the front window now, and bookshelves, and the outline of someone moving inside. He stayed across the street. At 9:03 the door opened and 2 children, maybe 8 and 10, siblings by the look of them, pushed inside, and a moment later he heard, across the quiet street, the sound of Charlotte's voice. He couldn't make out words, just the tone. Easy, warm, laughing at something the younger child said. He stood on the sidewalk in the December cold and heard his wife laugh with someone else's children and felt it move through him like a current. Not painful exactly, but not painless either. Something that required standing very still to survive. She was okay. She was more than okay. She was in the quiet of this small town with its salt air and its unhurried mornings, becoming something she'd been trying to be for years without the space to manage it. He crossed the street. He pushed open the door. The bell above it rang. Charlotte had her back to the door, reshelving something from a cart, and the 2 children were at a low table near the window doing something with a puzzle. The store smelled like paper and wood and something faintly herbal, a candle maybe, or dried flowers. Shelves floor to ceiling, organized in a way that felt personal rather than commercial, like someone's reading life had been arranged for company. Charlotte turned. The book in her hand was a picture book, large format, pale blue cover. She looked at the door, and then she saw him, and the picture book stayed in her hand and her face went very still. The children didn't notice. They were absorbed in their puzzle. Neither of them spoke. The bell above the door had stopped ringing. Charlotte turned and placed the book on the shelf without looking at it. Placed it deliberately, spine out, which it wasn't supposed to be. She corrected it immediately, spine facing outward, right way, and the small automatic correction of that gesture in the middle of this moment was the most human thing Damien had ever witnessed. She looked at him. How? She said. Not how did you find me? Not why are you here? Just how. The word stripped down to its essential disbelief. Hargrove, he said. I used my mother's name. I know. He's good at his job. She looked at the children briefly. The older one had glanced up. Give me a minute to... She moved to the counter and picked up her phone, sent a quick text. Their mother's next door, she said quietly. She'll come get them. She came out from behind the counter. She didn't move toward him. She stopped 8 feet away and stood with her arms loose at her sides, and he understood that she was doing the same thing he'd done for weeks in the study. Holding herself still, breathing through it, managing the size of the feeling so it didn't run the room. She looked different, not worse, not thinner or drawn, just rearranged somehow, like furniture in a house after someone's moved it to a more functional configuration, and you can see, only in retrospect, how cramped the old arrangement had been. Damien, she said. The word was flat. Not cold, just used up. I'm not here to... He stopped. He'd had 6 hours in a car to figure out what he was going to say, and he had nothing. I'm not here to argue. Okay. I need to tell you something. There's a situation. Her eyes changed. The specific shift from personal to operational, a shift he recognized because he'd spent years watching her make it at Foundation events. The moment where she set aside whatever she was actually feeling and managed the immediate practical reality. What kind of situation, she said. The mother of the 2 children came in then, apologetic, cheerful, gathering her kids with the efficient warmth of a woman who does this 10 times a day. Charlotte hugged the younger one, said goodbye to both of them with specific personal details that told him she knew these children well, knew their names and what they were working on and what they liked. The door closed. They were alone. There's a second investigative team in Dunmore, Damien said. They've been here 10 days. They're not mine. 10 days. They're not mine. Charlotte looked at him. And there's a possibility, he continued, that someone in the Ricci organization has identified you as a potential leverage point. It may be nothing, but I'm not treating it as nothing. She sat down on the small stool behind the counter. Just sat. Straight back, hands in her lap, looking at the middle distance. So I'm not safe, she said. You may not be. I don't know the full picture yet. And you came yourself. Yes. Without telling me it was coming, you just... She pressed 2 fingers to her forehead briefly. You just appeared. I know. That's not... She stopped, started again. Damien, I left. I did not leave so you could follow me with an investigative team. Her voice was measured, but there was something underneath it now, something hot and pressurized. I have been here for 5 weeks. I have not called you. I have not asked for help. I have not... I know. He didn't move toward her. He stayed where he was, near the door, in the position of someone who has entered but acknowledged that entering was already too much. Charlotte, I know you left. I'm not here to undo that. I'm here because if something happens to you because of my world... Your world, she said. The 2 words landed quietly. She looked at him. I lived in your world for 10 years, Damien. I ran your foundation. I covered for your absences. I sat at your tables. It was my world too. And it still is, apparently, because it followed me here. He said nothing. Did you read them? She asked. The shift caught him. He looked at her. The letters, she said. I know you went in the closet. I know you took the box. He held her gaze. Yes. She absorbed that. He watched her absorb it. The slight change in her breathing. The almost imperceptible set of her jaw. All of them? She asked. All of them. She looked away. Through the window to the street, gray December light, a gull passing slow over the roofline. Okay, she said softly. To herself more than to him. That was when Hargrove called. Damien answered because the ring pattern was the one they'd established for critical information. Talk. We got the LLC chain, Hargrove said. The second team. 3 layers of shell companies. Final ownership traces to a holding entity in Delaware. A pause. Mr. Blackwood, the registered agent on this Delaware entity is Vincent Caruso. The store was very quiet. Damien stood in the middle of it, holding the phone, and let the information settle through him like something dropped in deep water. Slow at first, then accelerating. Vincent. 20 years. The man who had told him Charlotte was disappearing, who had run interference with the crew, who had pushed to expand Hargrove's resources, who had said, "I understand what's happening. I'm not questioning your grief." Vincent, who had known about the Richie talk for 2 days and not told him. Vincent, who had his hand on Damien's arm in that hallway. "Are you certain?" Damien said. 3 separate verification points, Hargrove said. "Certain." Damien's voice, when it came out, was very controlled. The control of a man holding something down by force. "Don't move on him yet. Watch him. I want to know every contact he makes in the next 12 hours. He ended the call. Charlotte was looking at him. She had heard enough of his face to know something fundamental had shifted. "What?" she said. He stood in her bookstore in Dunmore, Maine, with the December light coming through the window and the smell of paper and candle wax around him, and the specific stillness of a man who has just discovered that the most dangerous person in his life is the one who has been standing at his right hand for 2 decades. "The second team," he said. "I know who sent them." She waited. "Vincent," he said. Charlotte's face did something complicated. She had met Vincent hundreds of times. She had been polite to him at 100 dinners. She had always sensed in him something she couldn't name, a kind of instrumental quality, a warmth that was calibrated rather than felt. "Why would Vincent—" she started. "Because I've been distracted for 5 weeks, Damien said. Because Ricci has been testing boundaries. Because if someone in my organization wanted to make a move and needed me either controlled or compromised—" He stopped. Ran the logic forward. "He wasn't helping me find you. He was finding you himself, keeping the information close, deciding when and how to use it." Charlotte stood up from the stool. "Use it," she said. "Use me." "As what?" Damien looked at her, and in the silence between the question and the answer, he understood, fully, finally, with the sickening completeness of a man who should have seen it sooner, that the woman who had left him to escape the violence of his world had been found by that world anyway, through the very man Damien had trusted to help him reach her. He had led them straight to her. Every search, every resource, every expanded query, he had handed Vincent a map. "We need to move," Damien said. "Now. Today." Charlotte looked at him. This man she had left. This man she had spent 10 years loving imperfectly and 5 weeks beginning to recover from, standing in the middle of her quiet, rebuilt life, telling her that it wasn't safe, and it wasn't hers, and it never fully would be. "I'm not running," she said. Her voice was firm, not angry. Firm. "I am not packing a bag and following you out of the life I have spent 5 weeks building because of a problem you created." "Charlotte, I am not running," she said again. "So whatever needs to happen next, you figure out how to do it without destroying this." She gestured, small, precise, at the store around her. At the shelves she'd organized and the children's table she'd set up, and the hand-painted sign above the door in the apartment upstairs where her 12 journals were stacked on a desk she'd chosen herself. Damien looked at her. He looked at the woman who had decided not to wait anymore, standing in the middle of what she'd built with the time he'd given her by being absent. And he understood with the full weight of it that there was no version of fixing this that didn't require him to become something he had not yet figured out how to be. He put his hand in his pocket. His fingers found the ring. He left it there. "Okay," he said. "Then I stay." "Okay," he said. "Then I stay." Those 3 words cost him something. Charlotte heard it in them. Not weakness, something more specific than weakness. The sound of a man dismantling a reflex he'd spent 20 years building, the reflex that said control the situation, move the pieces, manage the outcome. He wasn't managing anything right now. He was standing in her bookstore in his city jacket and his city shoes on her wide plank floor and saying he would stay because she'd told him not to run. And for once in their shared history, he was listening to her instead of the machinery in his head. She didn't thank him. She wasn't there yet. "There's a back room," she said. "You can make calls from there. I have customers coming in." He nodded and moved past her, careful, not touching her, giving her the width of the aisle, and she watched him go through the door behind the counter and heard it close, and then stood in her store alone for a moment, breathing. Then the bell above the front door rang, and the hardware store owner's wife came in looking for a gardening book, and Charlotte helped her find 3, and the morning continued. Damien made 9 calls in 2 hours. He made them quietly, standing in a small room that smelled like packing tape and old cardboard, surrounded by Charlotte's inventory system. Handwritten index cards rubber banded by category. A system so specific and personal, it could only have been developed by someone who'd had time and silence and no interruptions. He stood among her index cards and ran a parallel operation to the one she was running 12 feet away. The picture he assembled was not good. Vincent had been careful, years of careful, the kind you only manage if you've been planning something for longer than the obvious window. The shell company chain went deeper than 3 layers. Hargrove's team, pulling threads through the night, found a fourth entity connected to a real estate arrangement in Brooklyn that Damien recognized. A property he'd signed over to a holding company in 2019 at Vincent's recommendation. A deal he'd trusted because Vincent had recommended it, and he'd trusted Vincent. The property was now worth 4 times what they'd moved it for. The difference had gone somewhere. Hargrove was finding out where. He called Marco. "I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you," Damien said, "and I need you to understand it completely before you react." Marco, to his credit, said nothing, just waited. "Vincent is not to be informed of any operational decisions from this point forward. He is not to know my location. He is not to have contact with any external parties without one of our people present. You will manage this personally." A silence. The kind that has weight. "Marco." "I'm here." The younger man's voice was careful. "Sir, Vincent has been— I know what Vincent has been. Now I know what else he's been." Damien pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "Can you do what I'm asking?" "Yes." "Without tipping him?" "Yes." "He's going to notice the isolation. When he pushes back, you tell him I'm dealing with a personal situation and will contact him directly when I'm ready. Nothing else." "Understood." "And Marco, Ricci's people. Any movement toward this area, I want to know within minutes, not hours." "I'll set up a watch." Damien ended the call. He stood in the back room. Through the thin wall, he could hear Charlotte's voice. She was explaining something to a customer about a series of novels, talking about the 3rd book versus the 1st, which one to start with. Her voice was different here, not the voice she'd used at Foundation events, the smooth, professional warmth she'd deployed like a tool. This was something looser, more actual. He put his phone in his pocket. He stood there and breathed. At noon, she knocked on the back room door once and pushed it open and held out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper without looking at him directly. "From the diner," she said. "Thank you." She started to pull the door closed. "Charlotte." She stopped. "Vincent's been building something for at least 3 years," he said. "Maybe longer. The property deal in Brooklyn. You remember when I signed that over?" She looked at him. "I remember you telling me about it. I remember thinking it seemed fast. You said something. That night, you said it seemed fast. You said Vincent had vetted it." "I know." She leaned against the doorframe. "What does he want?" "Control," Damien said. "That's always what it is. He's been positioning, probably waiting for a moment of significant distraction." He paused. "I gave him one." Charlotte said nothing. "The team he sent here wasn't to hurt you," Damien said. "Not yet. It was surveillance. Documentation. If he had evidence of my location, my movements, evidence of how distracted I've been, how much I've—" He stopped. Started again, differently. "He needed leverage. Over me. You were the fastest way to get it." Charlotte looked at the sandwich in his hands and then at the floor and then at some point past his shoulder. "So I've been a liability," she said. "No. To your organization. My leaving created a vulnerability that someone is now exploiting." Her voice was even. "I want to be clear that I understand the situation." "Charlotte, I'm not saying it to make you feel something," she said. "I'm saying it because I need to understand what's actually happening." She pushed off the doorframe. "Eat the sandwich. I'll close at 4. She pulled the door closed. He ate the sandwich. The afternoon moved slowly and then all at once. At 2:17, Hargrove called with a location update on the 2nd team. They'd moved from the motel outside town, which meant they'd been tipped or they'd concluded their surveillance phase and were transitioning to something else. Either way, they were mobile now, and mobile was worse than static. At 2:40, Marco called to report that Vincent had made 3 calls in the last 2 hours. One to a number that traced to Thomas Ricci's personal attorney, one to the Shell LLC's registered agent, one to an untraceable cell. Damien stood up straight. Vincent had made a call to Ricci's attorney. He thought about that for exactly 4 seconds. Then he went through the door into the store. Charlotte was alone. The afternoon had gone quiet, just her at the counter with a book open, reading in the gaps between customers the way she always had, the way she'd been reading in gaps her whole life with him. She looked up. "We have a problem," he said. She closed the book. "How bad?" "Vincent has been in contact with Ricci's people. Within the last hour." She absorbed that. Her hands were flat on the counter. "What does that mean operationally?" "It means this stopped being a surveillance situation." He kept his voice level. "We need to assume that Ricci's people now know this location." Charlotte stood up from the stool. She reached under the counter. He watched her do it, surprised, and produced a set of car keys. "There's a back exit through the alley. My car is on Clement Street, 1 block north." He stared at her. "I grew up in a careful family," she said. "Different kind of careful than yours, but still." She came around the counter. 5 weeks alone in a new town. I found the exits." Something moved through him. Not quite pride, something more complicated and less comfortable than pride. "I'm not leaving," she said. "I told you I'm not running, but I want to know where the exits are." She held his gaze. "What do we do?" "I need to talk to Ricci directly," he said. "Tonight. If Vincent has told him I'm here, isolated, without the crew, and Thomas sees that as an opportunity." He worked through it out loud, which he'd never done with her, had never thought to do with her. Thomas is 29 years old and he's wanted to prove something since his father stepped back. If Vincent has been feeding him intelligence on my distraction, on the operational gaps, then Thomas thinks now is the time. Yes. "Can you call him? Ricci?" "He won't take a call from me right now. Too much advantage in not taking it." Damien moved to the window, looked out at the street. Gray afternoon, light going thin, a few people moving. Nothing wrong on the surface. "I need to put someone in front of him who he'll talk to, someone he doesn't see as a threat." Charlotte said, "What about his father?" Damien turned. "You've met the elder Ricci," she said, "at the Blackwood Foundation dinner in 2021. He came because his wife wanted to. You two spoke for, I don't know, 20 minutes? Longer? I watched you. He liked you. Old school, you said afterward." Damien looked at her. "He stepped back from the organization," she continued. "That doesn't mean Thomas stops taking his calls. It was a good idea. It was a better idea than anything he'd been turning over." He stood in her store and recognized, with the particular sensation of a thing arriving too late, that she had spent 10 years in rooms with these people and had been watching and thinking and noticing in the way that people notice things when no one is watching them do it. He'd been so busy managing the room, he'd never thought to ask what she saw. He pulled out his phone, found the number. Personal, given at that dinner, the kind of number the elder Ricci gave selectively. He called. 3 rings. "Mr. Blackwood." Anthony Ricci's voice was old and deliberate, a man in his 70s who had survived long enough to have no particular fear of phone calls. "Mr. Ricci, I apologize for the hour. It's 4 in the afternoon. I'm going to speak plainly, if you'll allow it." A pause. "I prefer it." "Your son is about to make a significant mistake," Damien said. "A mistake built on bad information from a compromised source inside my organization. I'm not calling to threaten and I'm not calling to ask for intervention. I'm calling as a courtesy, because I have a great deal of respect for how you built what you built, and what Thomas does in the next 24 hours will determine whether what you built survives his tenure." Silence on the line. "That's plain," Anthony Ricci said. "I thought you'd prefer it." Another silence. Longer. The elder Ricci breathing through whatever calculation he was making. "I'll make a call," he said. The line went dead. Charlotte had been watching him from across the store. She'd heard one side of it. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "Maybe," he said. She nodded and went to turn the sign on the door to closed. She'd just reached for it when the door opened from the outside. 2 men, not local. He could see that in 3 seconds flat, the way you see it when you've spent 20 years reading rooms and bodies and threat levels. They were dressed down, canvas jackets, jeans, but they carried themselves like people who had done physical work of a specific kind and were prepared to do it again. The shorter one had his right hand slightly forward, not reaching for anything, yet. Charlotte went still with her hand on the sign. Damien moved. Not toward the men, toward Charlotte. He was behind her in 2 steps, hand at the back of her elbow, not gripping, just present, and he said to the shorter man in his flattest voice, "Store's closing." The shorter man looked at him. Something shifted in his face. Recognition, recalculation. "Mr. Blackwood," he said. "Store's closing," Damien said again. The two men looked at each other. The exchange was brief and had a language. Then the shorter one looked back at Damien and said, "We're just here to talk." "Then call my office," Damien said. "Make an appointment." Mr. Caruso thought, "Vincent Caruso," Damien said, and his voice dropped to something that wasn't quite a register humans usually operated in. "Does not speak for me. He does not direct my associates. He does not send people to my location." He held the shorter man's gaze and felt Charlotte absolutely motionless beside him. "You've made an error in judgment about who gave you your instructions. I'd encourage you to go call your employer and clarify the situation before you make a second one." The shorter man's jaw was set. He was working through something. 29-year-old Thomas Ricci's men, probably, dispatched by Vincent with whatever story Vincent had assembled. They were evaluating, calculating whether the man in front of them was what he was presenting as, or whether the intelligence they'd been given, distracted, weakened, isolated, matched the reality. Damien let them calculate. He stood very still and let them look at him, and he gave them nothing. Whatever they saw, they made a decision. The shorter man nodded once, barely, and stepped back. Both of them went out the door. The bell rang above it. They were gone. Charlotte exhaled. It was a small sound, controlled, but he heard it. "You okay?" he asked. "Don't ask me that right now," she said. He took his hand from her elbow. She walked to the door, and this time she turned the sign to closed and locked it, and stood with her back to him, forehead almost touching the glass, looking out at the street where the two men were getting into a gray sedan 60 yards up. "They're going to come back," she said. "Not those two," he said, "but others, maybe. Or they escalate the approach." She turned around. Her face was very composed, which he knew by now, had learned too late, but knew, was not the same as fine. "I have people I know here," she said. "The couple at the diner, the librarian, people who've been kind to me." She looked at him directly. "I'm not going to let your world burn them. It won't come to that. You don't know that. I'm going to end this tonight," he said. She looked at him. "How?" "Vincent needs to understand what he's risked," Damien said, "not from a distance, in person." He was moving through it now, the operational logic clicking forward. "If I call him here, tell him I need him. Play distressed. Play like I'm falling apart. Give him the version he already believes he's seen." "He comes to you," Charlotte said. "He comes to me. Here, where I'm in control of the environment." "Here," she repeated. "In my store." He looked at her. "I know what I'm asking. Do you? I'm asking you to let me bring the problem to where you are, which is the opposite of what you left to avoid." She held his gaze for a long moment. "What do you need from me?" she said. The call to Vincent went out at 5:42. Damien made it from the back room, door open so Charlotte could hear if she chose to. He let something into his voice that wasn't entirely performance, because the truth was the best versions of deception always had real bones. And he said, "Vincent, I think I've made a mistake. Coming here. I need you up here. Tonight if you can." Vincent's response was careful and warm in the way that Vincent's responses had apparently always been careful and warm. And Damien listened to it and heard the calculation underneath it, the specific quality of a man receiving exactly the information he's been waiting for, and he said, "Yes, Dunmore, Maine. I'll text you the address," and he ended the call and sat for a moment in the stillness. Then he texted Marco. "He'll be on the road within the hour. I want 2 of ours ahead of him and 2 behind. No contact until I give the word." Marco responded in under a minute. "Done." Charlotte came to the doorway. She'd made tea, 2 cups, and she held one out to him. He took it. She leaned against the opposite wall and held to hers and didn't drink it. "He's coming," Damien said. "When?" 3 hours, maybe 4, depending on traffic. She nodded. They stood in the small back room among her index cards and her inventory system, and outside the windows of the store. The December dark was coming in fast over the Maine coast, and they drank their tea in silence. Not the silence of estrangement, something different, something that didn't have a clean name. "I want to tell you something," Damien said. She waited. "The letter you wrote in June," he said. "Year 3. You wrote about a dinner party. You said I knew what everyone in the room needed to feel, and I gave it to them, and you said you couldn't remember the last time I'd done that for you." Charlotte's hands tightened slightly around the cup. She said nothing. "You were right," he said. "You were describing something real, and He stopped. Not performing the stop. Actually stopping because the next part was harder than calling Vincent, Harder than reading the letters. Harder than any of the night's operational maneuvering. I knew. On some level, I knew. I just let the machine run because the machine was easier than... He looked at the cup in his hands. You were never the machine. No, she said quietly. I wasn't. I made you maintain yourself without help for 10 years, and you did it, and I relied on that, and I should not have. He looked up at her. I'm not saying this to get something. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear it said clearly, and I don't know how many more chances I'm going to get. Charlotte looked at him for a long time. Then she set her cup down on a shelf and said, The man with the ice cream, 2 in the morning. You remembered I'd mentioned it 3 weeks earlier. He remembered. He hadn't thought about it in years. That man still exists, she said. I've been looking for him for a long time. She picked her cup back up. I'm not ready to say anything about what comes after tonight, but I want you to know I see the difference between who you were and who you're trying to be right now. The back room was very quiet. Outside, the Atlantic pushed against the coast in the dark. At 9:18, Marco texted, He's 12 minutes out. Damien stood up. Charlotte took the cups to the small sink and rinsed them with the focused practicality of someone who needs something to do with their hands. Go upstairs, Damien said. The apartment. She turned around. No. Charlotte, I'm not hiding in my own building, she said. I'll stay in the back. I won't come out. But I'm not hiding. He looked at her. Okay, he said. She went to the back room and pulled the door to, not closed, just nearly. He heard her sit down, the slight creak of the chair. He went to the front of the store. He turned on 2 lamps. The overhead stayed off. The store settled into amber light, bookshelves casting long shadows, the front windows dark against the night outside. He stood behind the counter. He put his hand in his jacket pocket. The ring was there. Had been there all day. He held it for a moment. That small platinum fact, everything she'd said about not needing decoration, about a wedding band being a fact, and facts not needing ceremony. He let it go. He needed both hands. At 9:20, the headlights of a single car moved across the front windows. The car stopped. A door opened. Vincent Caruso walked up the front step of Title Books and pushed open the door, and the bell rang, and he stepped inside looking exactly as he always looked, silver-haired, compact, composed. And then he saw Damien standing behind the counter in the amber light, and something moved across his face before he could fully control it. Not guilt. Not exactly. Something more structural than guilt. The expression of a man who has run a calculation and found an unexpected variable. Damien, he said, close the door, Vincent. Vincent closed it. He looked around the store briefly, assessing, the way he always assessed, and then back at Damien. You sounded bad on the phone, Vincent said. I know. You're not bad. Not a question. His voice shifted a fraction. Still warm. Still careful. Still the voice of a man who had managed difficult conversations for 20 years and knew how to hold the temperature of a room. What's going on? I want to ask you something, Damien said. And I want you to understand before you answer that I have the complete LLC chain, all 4 layers. I have the property documentation from Brooklyn. I have your call logs from today, including the contact with Ricci's attorney. He paused. I want to ask you anyway, because I want to hear you say it. Vincent's face was very still. How long? Damien said. A silence. Then quietly. And this was the thing that would stay with Damien, the specific quality of it, how unsurprised Vincent sounded, how almost relieved. Vincent said, Long enough. Damien's hands were flat on the counter. You were going to use her, Damien said. Charlotte. As leverage. Against me. I was going to use the situation, Vincent said. You gave me the situation, and there it was. The warmth gone. The calibration gone. Something much older and harder underneath it. You've been falling apart for 6 weeks over a woman who left you, Damien. You stopped being present. You gave Ricci an opening. You gave the Castellano arrangement uncertainty. You sat in that study reading letters at 2 in the morning and let the whole structure get soft. Vincent's voice was measured, controlled, the voice of a man making an argument he believes. Someone had to hold it. Someone had to hold it, Damien repeated. Yes. By positioning to take control of the organization. By ensuring the organization survived your grief. By sending men to find my wife and document her location and sit on that information and feed intelligence about my vulnerabilities to Thomas Ricci while managing the optics of helping me search for her. Vincent said nothing. That's what happened, Damien said. Say it plainly. And in the amber light of Charlotte's bookstore, with the Atlantic dark outside and everything that had been built over 20 years sitting in the space between two men who had survived together and now stood on opposite sides of something that could not be uncrossed, Vincent Caruso looked at the man he had served and managed and quietly maneuvered around for 2 decades and said, yes. The door to the back room opened. Charlotte stood in the doorway. She looked at Vincent. He looked at her. And whatever Vincent had been prepared for, operational confrontation, negotiation, the particular brutal chess of men who had spent their lives in dangerous rooms, he had not been prepared for her. She said, "Did you know about the biopsy scare in March 4 years ago?" Vincent blinked. "She went through that alone," Damien said. Charlotte was still in the doorway of the back room. She hadn't moved. She was watching him with the particular stillness she'd developed over years of watching him manage endings. The stillness of someone who has learned to wait for the room to decompress before speaking. "Is it over?" she asked. "Vincent is over," he said. "The rest takes time." She nodded slowly. "The men he sent, the 2 who came in this afternoon," he said. "They were Ricci's, not his personal crew. They won't move without Thomas's direction, and Thomas won't move now that his father has made a call. You think the elder Ricci actually reached him? I think Anthony Ricci built something over 40 years, and he's not going to let his son dismantle it in a night because a man he never trusted fed him bad intelligence." Damien moved toward the window, looked out at the empty street. "Thomas is ambitious. He's not stupid. If his father told him the information was compromised, he'll stand down and reassess. And if he doesn't?" Damien turned from the window. "Then we deal with that. But tonight I think it's done." Charlotte uncrossed her arms. She moved to the counter and reached beneath it and produced a bottle of whiskey, Irish, the kind with the simple label, and 2 small glasses that were clearly not meant for whiskey, being the kind of short tumblers you keep in a back room for coffee or water. She poured 2 fingers into each and set one on the counter without looking at him. He came to the counter. He picked up the glass. She picked up hers. They didn't toast. There was nothing to toast. They just drank, and the whiskey was decent and the store was warm and outside the Atlantic moved against the coast in the dark, the way it had been doing before any of this, and would continue doing long after. "I have to go back to New York," he said. "I know. Not tonight, but within a few days. There are things that need to be handled. Vincent's removal creates a structural gap. The Ricci situation needs to be formally resolved. The Castellano agreement needs a face-to-face." "I know," she said again. Not cold, just accurate. "I'm telling you because—" He stopped, looked at the glass. "I'm not telling you as an excuse. I'm not telling you the way I used to. Business, Charlotte, unavoidable, Charlotte. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what I'm walking into, and I don't. I'm trying to be someone who tells you things." He looked up at her. "I'm not very good at it yet." Charlotte turned her glass slowly in her hands. "I know you're not," she said. They stood like that for a while, the bottle between them, the lamplight doing what lamplight does. "Where are you staying tonight?" she asked. "There's a motel." She was quiet for a moment, then, "The couch in the apartment upstairs folds out. It's not comfortable, but it's there." He looked at her carefully. "I'm not saying anything other than what I said," she clarified. Her voice was even. No room for misreading. "It's a cold night and you're here and the motel is 8 miles out and the couch is there." "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. She put the bottle away. He called Marco at 10:45 from the stairwell outside her apartment, standing in the narrow space with the old wood banister and the smell of the building. Salt and timber. And the particular age of a coastal structure that had been breathing in weather for 100 years. Marco reported that Vincent was south on the highway, making no stops, no calls to any flagged numbers. The 2 surveillance units were rotating coverage. "When he gets back to the city," Damien said, "I want a meeting, not tomorrow, day after. I want the full senior structure present, not informed ahead of time, just called in." "That's going to signal something." "It should signal something, that's the point." He leaned against the wall. The wood was cold through his jacket. "I'm going to address the organization. Everything. Vincent, the structural gaps, what comes next. I'm not managing optics on this. I'm not going to let a story form in the absence of information. Understood. Marco paused. Sir, they're going to want to know if you're steady. I know they are. Are you? Damien looked up the stairwell toward the thin line of light under Charlotte's door. He thought about the back room and its index cards. He thought about the box of letters. He thought about a biopsy scare in March 4 years ago that he had not known about. Tell them I'll be there, he said. That should be answer enough. He went upstairs. Charlotte had made up the fold-out couch with the specific efficiency of someone who has no sentimentality left about the gesture. Fitted sheet tucked tight, one pillow, one blanket folded at the foot. It was a small apartment, clean and particular in the way her spaces always were, organized by someone who'd had to build a home twice. Books stacked with intention. A desk by the window with 12 journals aligned on its surface. A rug that looked second-hand and carefully chosen. A small lamp on the kitchen counter throwing warm light across everything. She was in the kitchen making tea she probably didn't need. He sat on the edge of the fold-out and looked at the journals on the desk. The new ones, she said, not turning around. Since Maine? Since Maine. He didn't ask what was in them. That wasn't his territory, and he knew it now in a way he hadn't before. She brought 2 mugs and set one on the table near the couch and took hers to the chair across the room. The reading chair, positioned by the window, turned slightly toward the water view. She sat with her feet tucked up and held the mug in both hands and looked at the middle distance. Tell me what you're going to do, she said. After New York. He looked at her. What do you mean? With the organization, with the structure. What's the actual plan, Damien? She turned her eyes to him. Because I've heard things before. I've heard things are going to change, and I'm working on it, and I don't have the energy for another version of that. So if you have an actual plan, tell me. And if you don't have one yet, tell me that. He was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about delegation, he said. Real delegation. Not assigning tasks. Restructuring authority. There are 3 men in the organization who have been capable of significantly more responsibility for years, and I've kept the decision-making centralized because... He stopped. Said it honestly. Because control was how I knew I mattered. In that world. If I controlled the decisions. I was essential, and if I was essential, I didn't have to ask whether I was anything else. Charlotte's expression didn't change, but she was listening the way she listened when something mattered. I want to build something that doesn't require me to be in every room, he said. Something that functions while I'm elsewhere. Choosing to be elsewhere. He looked down at his hands. That's going to take time, a year, maybe more. It's not a clean break. I don't want to pretend it is. I know it's not a clean break, she said, but it's a real direction, not a gesture. She was quiet for a moment. What do you want, Damien? She said. Not operationally, not for the organization. What do you actually want? He looked at her. Across the small apartment in the lamplight, this woman in the chair by the window, with her tea and her journals and her rebuilt life, and her particular form of patience that was not passive, that had never been passive, that was, he understood now, the most active and demanding and costly kind of patience there was. I want to deserve another chance, he said. I don't know if I've earned it yet. I know I haven't, but I want the chance to earn it. She looked at him for a long time. That's honest, she said. I'm trying to be. I know you are. She turned back toward the window. The dark Atlantic was out there, not visible but present. You could hear it if the room was quiet enough. I'm not giving you an answer tonight, about any of it. I want you to understand that clearly. I understand. I need you to go back to New York and do what you need to do, and I need that to happen without any promises attached to it. Not because I'm being cruel, because I've spent 10 years investing in promises that didn't clear, and I don't have the... I can't. She stopped. Her jaw was set. Do what needs to be done because it needs to be done, not for me. Okay, he said. She finished her tea. She stood up and went to the bedroom, and the door didn't close all the way. Old latch. The kind that required the specific angle that someone who lived here would know, and a visitor wouldn't. A thin line of light remained. He lay back on the fold-out couch, which was as uncomfortable as advertised, and looked at the ceiling of her apartment. He did not sleep for a long time, but eventually he did. He drove back to New York the next morning. Charlotte came downstairs at 7 and made coffee, real coffee, in an actual pot, the kind of domestic ritual that has its own specific gravity. And he sat at her small kitchen table in yesterday's shirt and accepted a cup, and they talked briefly about practical things. The second team that Vincent had placed, whether their presence in the town needed to be addressed directly or whether their departure would be automatic once their employer's operational capacity was removed. They'll leave, he said. Without direction, they have no mandate, and without Vincent's resources backing them, how quickly? 24 hours, maybe less. She nodded. The couple at the diner, the Hendersons. They noticed unfamiliar vehicles this past week, asked me about it. What did you tell them? That I'd had some unwanted attention from a situation in my previous life and that I was handling it. She held her cup. They didn't push. People here don't push. I'll have Hargrove do a confirmation sweep once I'm back, he said. Confirm the team has withdrawn. You'll know within 48 hours. Okay. He stood and brought his cup to the sink and washed it, which he did without thinking, and set it in the drying rack. She watched him do it and said nothing. He picked up his jacket from the couch. At the door, he stopped. The journal's on your desk, he said. The 12 from before. She looked at him. I want you to know I'm going to reread them, he said. Not to find things, not to understand strategically, just to... I don't want to forget again what I read. I don't want to go back to not knowing. He held the jacket in his hands. You wrote those for yourself, I know that. But they're also the most accurate account of our marriage that exists, and I want to carry them. Charlotte looked at him for a long moment. The box is in the study, she said finally. You know where it is. He nodded. He went down the stairs and out through the bookstore and into the December morning and got in his car and drove south. The meeting happened 48 hours later in the back room of a restaurant in Red Hook that the organization had used for senior gatherings since before Damien took over. 12 men. The full structure, called in without explanation, which had generated exactly the tension he'd intended. Men who'd been told nothing and had therefore been generating their own narratives for 2 days. Narratives that would be more anxious than the reality, which was the correct psychological starting position for what he needed to accomplish. He walked in without Marco, without preamble, and stood at the head of the table and looked at each of them in turn. Then he told them, not everything. There were operational specifics that didn't belong in a group setting, evidence that needed to be handled through proper channels, the particular legal architecture of Vincent's exposure that was better managed quietly. But the essential structure of it, that Vincent Caruso had been running a secondary operation within the organization for an undetermined period of time, that he had made contact with a rival entity using intelligence gathered from within their own structure, that his access to organizational assets and information was terminated effective immediately, and all existing arrangements bearing his authorization were under review. The room was very still. He watched their faces. He knew how to read them. Had been reading them for 15 years. Shock on 2, which meant genuinely not involved. Careful blankness on 4, which meant processing and withholding reaction pending more information. And on 1, a capo named Del Russo, who'd been with Vincent longer than he'd been with Damien. Something that moved too fast across his face to fully identify before it was controlled. Damien filed it. Questions, he said. There were many. He answered the ones that deserved answers and deferred the ones that didn't, and held the room the way he'd always held rooms, with the specific authority of a man who has accepted that authority, costs something, and is paying the cost willingly. An hour later, walking out, Marco fell in beside him. Del Russo, Damien said quietly. I saw it, Marco said. Nothing moves against him yet. Watch him. I want to know every contact for the next 30 days. Done. And the Castellano meeting, set it up, this week if they'll have it. They've been waiting. I'll make the call. Damien stopped on the sidewalk. The Brooklyn air was cold and tasted like the river. He stood in it for a moment. Marco, he said. Sir? You did good work this week. Marco looked at him. The younger man was 34, had been with Damien for 7 years, had never heard those specific words in that specific order, and wasn't entirely certain how to receive them. Thank you, he said finally. Damien nodded and got in the car. The Castellano meeting went well. Not perfectly. Nothing in this world went perfectly, and the men who pretended otherwise were the ones who eventually collapsed under the weight of their own fiction, but substantively, meaningfully well. Paul Castellano III, who was older than Thomas Ricci and considerably less interested in proving things, listened to Damien's account of the Vincent situation with the attentiveness of a man who had survived by understanding which information changed his calculus. You could have managed this quietly, Castellano said. The Vincent situation. You're telling me directly. Yes. Why? Because the intelligence he was feeding to Ricci's side would have eventually included information relevant to your interests as well, Damien said. And because I'd rather you hear the full account from me than a partial account from someone else. Castellano looked at him for a moment. Then he said, The agreement stands. I appreciate that. Don't appreciate it, Castellano said. I'm not doing it for goodwill. I'm doing it because you're apparently still the most reliable man at this table, and that's worth something to me operationally. He picked up his coffee. But I'll take the goodwill too. Damien almost smiled. The restructuring took 6 weeks. He had not expected it to be clean, and it wasn't clean. Del Russo turned out to be not a co-conspirator exactly, but a passive beneficiary of Vincent's side arrangements. He'd known more than he should have and said less than he should have, which was its own category of disloyalty. He was moved out of the senior structure with the kind of precision that communicated consequence without requiring explicit statement. The 2 remaining men with operational authority got expanded mandates. New boundaries, new chains of accountability. During those 6 weeks, Damien did not go to Maine. He called Charlotte twice. Brief calls, practical in content, the confirmation that the second team had withdrawn, which she acknowledged with a short thank you, and a week later a call she answered after 4 rings, in which he told her the primary New York situation was resolved, and she said okay, and asked how he was sleeping, and he said better than I was, which was true, and she said good, and they said good night. He read the letters again, all 47, in order, from the beginning. The second reading was different from the first. The first time he'd been in the acute phase, the rawness of fresh understanding, the specific pain of a man encountering the full record of his failures in compressed form. The second time he read them more slowly, with the particular attention of someone who is trying to memorize rather than process. He noticed different things. The consistency of her voice across 10 years, the way it never turned bitter, never descended into accusation or performance, stayed recognizably hers from the first letter to the last. The small moments of happiness she'd recorded alongside the difficult ones. An afternoon in the garden, a trip she'd taken alone to a museum, a book she'd loved, a conversation with a neighbor. She had not spent 10 years miserable. She had spent 10 years building a life in the spaces around an absence, and some of what she built was genuinely good. He sat with that. At the end of January, he called her. She answered on the second ring. I'd like to come back to Dunmore, he said. Not to stay, just a visit, if that's something you're open to. A silence on her end. Not long. Not the silence of reluctance, something more like the silence of someone making a genuine assessment. When, she said. Whenever works for you. Your schedule, not mine. Another pause, briefer. Saturday, she said. The store is closed Saturday. He drove up Saturday morning. He arrived at 11. She was outside the store when he pulled up. Not waiting for him, she was sweeping the front step with the focused attention of a woman doing a task. And she looked up when he parked and gave a single nod that said, You're here without saying anything else. He got out of the car. He'd brought nothing. No flowers. That had seemed like a performance of a gesture rather than a gesture. No gifts. Just himself, in a different jacket than the one from December, one that was less city formal, that he'd chosen with the specific intent of wearing something that didn't announce his other life. Coffee? She said. Yes. They went inside. She made coffee in the small kitchen behind the store, and he sat on a stool at the counter and looked at the bookshelves through the open door, and she moved around the kitchen with the ease of someone in a space that has become genuinely hers. The Henderson couple, he said. You mentioned them. Frank and Ruth. They run the diner. How'd you end up knowing them? She set a mug in front of him. I ate there alone my first week here, 4 mornings in a row. Ruth came and sat across from me on the 4th morning and said, You look like you're figuring something out, and I've got nothing better to do for 20 minutes. Charlotte sat on the other stool. We talked for an hour. He looked at his coffee. That's the kind of person I'd never have met, he said, in our life before. No, she said. The foundation crowd was different. The foundation crowd was useful to me, he said. Ruth Henderson wouldn't have been useful to me, so I would have moved past her. He wrapped his hands around the mug. That's a significant thing to say out loud. Yes, Charlotte said. It is. They drank their coffee. She showed him the town. This was not planned. It happened the way things happen when two people are in the same place with hours ahead of them and no agenda established. She had a route she walked most days, she said, and he said, I'll come, and she said, okay, and they walked. She walked him through the main street and introduced him briefly to the hardware store owner who was sweeping his own step and who looked at Damien with the open, uncomplicated assessment of a man who judges new people on no information except what's in front of him. She walked him past the library where the librarian, a tall woman named Agnes, who appeared to be approximately 80 and entirely formidable, peered at him through the window and gave Charlotte a look that communicated an entire conversation through glass. Charlotte laughed at that. He heard it, the actual laugh, unperformed, slightly at the librarian's expense and not unkind. She's been asking about you, Charlotte said as they kept walking. About me? About the person who came to the store in December. I didn't explain. She glanced at him. I didn't know what to explain. What did you tell her? That you were someone from my previous life and that I wasn't sure yet what that meant. He looked at the sidewalk. That's accurate. I thought so. They reached the end of the main street where the road turned and the water opened up. A small parking area, a wooden bench, a view of the Atlantic that was gray and enormous and entirely indifferent to the humans standing at its edge. The wind came off it hard and cold and tasted like everything that had crossed it before reaching this particular point of coast. They stood at the railing. I've been thinking about the biopsy scare, she said, not looking at him, looking at the water. He went still. March, 4 years ago, she said. You read about it. Yes. I want you to understand what it was like to sit in that waiting room. Her voice was even. She was not doing this to wound him. He could hear that. She was doing it because she had decided to be direct about specific things. Not because I want you to feel guilty. The guilt doesn't help either of us. But I want you to understand concretely, not abstractly, what 10 years of that was like. She paused. I held my own hand. That's not a metaphor. I literally held my own hand, right hand holding left, while I waited for the results. And I thought, if it's bad news, who do I call first? And I went through the list. And your name was on the list, but it was... She stopped. It was not near the top, because even then I already knew that calling you would mean managing your reaction on top of managing my own fear, and I didn't have the capacity for both. The wind came off the water. I was not a person you could call, he said. No, she said. You weren't. I want to be. She turned and looked at him, full on. The direct look she had, the one that didn't make room for softness that wasn't earned. I know you do, she said. I believe that you want to be. She turned back to the water. Wanting it and being it are different things. I know you know that. I need you to prove it across time, not in a gesture, not in a week. Across time, in the ordinary moments when there's nothing dramatic happening and no crisis to rise to. When it's just a Tuesday and someone needs to be present. Yes, he said. That's the part I don't know yet, she said. Whether you can do it in the Tuesdays. He looked at the water. I have a letter, he said. She looked at him. I wrote one, he said. I know it's not the same thing. Yours were private, they were for you. I'm not trying to... He stopped, reorganized. I wrote one because I had 47 things I needed to respond to, and I couldn't do it out loud without it becoming a performance. And you deserve better than my performance. He reached into his jacket. The envelope was folded once, unsealed. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment. She took it. She didn't open it. I'll read it later, she said. Okay. She put it in her coat pocket and they stood at the railing in the wind and the cold, and after a while she said, There's a decent seafood place 3 blocks from here. Frank Henderson recommended it approximately 6 times. I haven't gone yet. Why not? Because it felt like a place you go with someone, she said. Not alone. He looked at her. Lunch? He said. Lunch, she said. They walked. He stayed until 4. They ate. The seafood place was warm and genuinely unpretentious, with paper placemats and a chalkboard menu, and a server named Danny, who was 17 and slightly nervous and did his job well anyway. They ate fish chowder and something fried and drank water and talked about things that were not the organization and not the marriage. Not directly. She told him about a book she was ordering in bulk for the store, A novel by an author she'd discovered 6 years ago and never recommended to anyone because there had been no one to recommend things to. He told her about a house in Connecticut, not far from where they'd been married, that he'd been looking at, not to buy, just looking, in the way that you look at things when you're trying to understand what you want next. She asked what kind of house. He said it was old, needs work, on a couple of acres, near the water but not waterfront. A house that had been something and could be something again with the right amount of attention. She was quiet for a moment. "That's a specific thing to be looking at," she said. "I know," he said. She didn't say anything else about it. He drove back to New York at 4:15. She stood outside the store and watched him get in the car, and he rolled down the window. "The letter," he said. If you have anything you want to say after reading it, I'd want to hear it." She looked at him. Her hand was in her pocket where the envelope was. "I know you would," she said. It wasn't yes. He hadn't expected yes. He drove south. He read her response 3 weeks later. It arrived by mail, actual mail, in an envelope with her handwriting on the front, postmarked Dunmore, Maine, which he suspected she'd done deliberately. She'd written 4 pages in the hand he knew, the efficient slanted print, and he sat in the study in the house on Long Island and read it at the desk with the letters in their box in the corner and the ring no longer in his pocket because he'd put it back in its place in the small crystal dish, not on her dresser, but on his own, where he could see it. She wrote about what she'd felt reading his letter. Carefully, the way she wrote everything. Not performing, not protecting, just describing with the precision of someone who had spent years learning the exact shape of their own interior. She wrote about the biopsy scare again, but differently this time. She wrote that she had decided, sitting with it after their conversation at the water, that she no longer wanted to use it as evidence. Not because it didn't matter. It mattered. It was real. It had happened, and it had cost her. But she was tired of carrying her wounds as arguments. She wanted to put them down, not forget them, just stop needing them to win something. She wrote, "I have been very good at surviving without you. That was necessary, and I'm not ashamed of it. But I've started to wonder if surviving without you has become its own kind of habit. And I'm not sure habits made in emergencies should be permanent." He read that sentence twice. She wrote that she was not ready to move, that Dunmore was hers, and she wasn't giving it back to loneliness or to obligation or to the version of their life that had made it necessary. But she wrote that she had eaten at the seafood place again, the week after he left, and she'd bought a book. And it was fine, but it was less than lunch had been. She wrote, at the end, "Come back in March. We can figure out what a Tuesday looks like." He put the letter in the box with the others. He drove to Maine 3 weeks earlier than March. He didn't tell her he was coming. He drove up on a Wednesday. A Tuesday was too on the nose, he'd decided, which was a kind of humor he was only recently discovering he possessed. And he arrived at 11 in the morning and walked into the bookstore while she was reshelving, and she turned around and looked at him and shook her head slowly. "You couldn't wait until March," she said. "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment, something in her face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "There are boxes in the back that need to go to the top shelf," she said. "The ladder's unsteady, and I've been avoiding it." "I can do that," he said. "I know you can," she said. "That's why I'm telling you." He went to the back room. He found the boxes. He found the ladder, which was indeed unsteady. A wooden thing with a joint that needed tightening, the kind of problem that is small and practical and entirely solvable if someone simply has the time to address it. He tightened it with a screwdriver he found in a drawer of the counter, tested it, and carried the boxes to the front. He spent an hour shelving books while Charlotte helped 2 customers and argued mildly with a book distributor on the phone and moved through her store with the ease of someone who has built something and knows every inch of it. At some point, without either of them marking the moment, they were simply in the same space doing the same work. And the space was warm and smelled like paper, and the light through the windows was February thin but present, and outside the small town moved at its unhurried pace, and the Atlantic was out there beyond the roofline doing what it had always done. He handed her a book that had been shelved incorrectly. Wrong section, someone's return that hadn't been checked. She looked at the cover and said thank you, and walked it to the right shelf. He watched her do it. He thought about the letter in the box at home, and her mother's bracelet on the wrist she had not packed back into a suitcase, and the ring in the crystal dish that was not on anyone's finger yet, but was no longer on a marble floor. He thought about March, and what a Tuesday looked like, and the kind of house that had been something and could be something again with the right amount of attention. He climbed the ladder and put the last box on the top shelf and came back down and steadied the base before he stepped off. A small automatic thing, and Charlotte was standing nearby having noticed, and she said, "The joint was loose." "I tightened it," he said. She looked at the ladder and then at him. "Good," she said. It was the most ordinary word she had ever said to him, and it landed in him like something that had traveled a very long way and finally arrived. He stayed until closing. When she turned the sign on the door to closed and locked it, and turned around to find him still there, in the amber lamplight among the bookshelves, she stopped and looked at him, and there was a long quiet in which the whole of it lived. The 10 years and the letters and the ring on the floor, and the 6 hours north on a December highway, and the whiskey and the small glasses, and the fold-out couch, and the town on the January water, and the lunch, and the letter, and this Wednesday that was not March, but was here anyway. She crossed the room. She stood in front of him. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced the ring. She had been carrying it, he realized. She had taken it from the dish at some point without telling him. She had been carrying it, and she held it up between them in the lamplight. "I'm not putting this back on tonight," she said. Her voice was steady and clear. "I want you to understand that. This is not that moment." "I know," he said. "But I've been carrying it," she said, "because I'm not ready to not carry it either." He looked at the ring between her fingers. The platinum caught the light. Simple band. "A fact," she'd said once. "Facts don't need decoration." "I understand," he said. She put the ring back in her pocket. She did not move away. The lamplight held them both in its small, warm radius, and outside the February coast was dark and cold, and the Atlantic kept on in its enormous, indifferent way, and inside the bookstore in the town she had built a life in, the woman who had learned to hold her own hand and the man who had finally understood what it cost her, stood close enough that the distance between them was no longer the distance of strangers, not together yet, not back to what they were. What they were was gone, specifically and permanently gone, and the thing that might come next would have to be built from different materials. But here, both of them here. One ordinary Wednesday.